evil and suffering clearly from all of these different presentations and reflections and Q&A and exchanges. It is a multidimensional problem. There's no doubt about that. And when we think about more specific form of evil, such as the pandemic, COVID-19, I think most of us, we think about our personal situations, and we think about, if I'm not mistaken, we probably seek some kind of personal resolution. About why is there, why am I suffering, or why is it, so complicated, or all sorts of personal issues, and so on. And perhaps we tend to look for specific psychological / mental, ethical, spiritual, and religious advice about how to overcome some of these situations, difficulties, trials that we face. But it seems to me that while in the practical advice is what we need at the end of the day, we cannot really resolve this issue completely without what I would call some kind of cognitive engagement. So I think it was great that we also had philosophical perspectives looking at the origin of evil and from an ontological and metaphysical perspective. I think it has to also involve those questions. It cannot simply be psychological. There has to be some kind of ontology, nature of reality. Why is the world like this? Why do we have a world which does not seem to be perfect? How do we square this with a notion of God who is supposed to be loving and perfect, and so on and so forth? So these are questions. So I think there is that theoretical dimension. So it's good that we have a kind of balance. Some talks are geared specifically toward kind of providing more practical orientation toward this. But at the same time, others are more about theoretical reflection. I think both are needed. So that's that. So after these talks, we'll also have a very open roundtable discussion, and everyone is welcome to ask or provide even comments about anything related to evil and suffering and the pandemic. All right, so let me just now begin with Professor Rustom's bio. So it's really an honor, but also very difficult to really introduce Professor Rustom because I know him for many, many years. And over the years, I've learned from him, not just as a young scholar, but also from his humanity, I would say. And like as a human being, I learned a lot of things, and I really value those things as well. So Professor Rustom, to me, is someone really an inspiring figure. Even though he himself is very young, but he has accomplished so much. It's really one of those exemplary young scholars. So officially, he's professor of Islamic thought at Carleton University, but he's really a leading scholar in his areas of expertise, namely in Sufism, Islamic thought, and now he's moving more into also global philosophy, constructive thought, and so forth. And he has a number of forthcoming publications in these areas. But his more recent books include In Rushes of the Heart, The Sufi Philosophy of Ain al-Qudat, coming out next year by SUNY Press. And then The Essence of Reality, A Defense of Philosophical Sufism, New York University Press, just came out. It's a wonderful translation of a seminal Arabic text written by this famous Sufi called Ain al-Qudat. And then Global Philosophy, a source book. It's a huge volume forthcoming. Dr. Rustom is also the editor of Equinox Publishing's Global Philosophy series, commissioning editor of the Journal of the Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi Society, and editorial board member of the Library of Arabic Literature. It's really wonderful to have you, Professor Rustom, and really working. It's been a pleasure working with you as well. This conference. The floor is yours.
The honor's been all mine. Thank you very much. So yeah, as Mohammed was saying, I'm going to try my very best not to take up too much of your time because there are so many things that still have to be done, and we have the fortunate pleasure and curse all at the exact same time of being aware of the internal workings of a conference like this. So I actually recognize that I actually have probably less than 25 minutes. But I don't want to take away or eat away the time of Atif Khalil, Professor Khalil, and Professor Mukhtar Ali. So I'm going to keep my comments a little brief. And the title of my talk, I believe it's something like learning to listen and listening to learn. So let me just jump right into it. Over a decade ago, I delivered a lecture which was part of a monthly philosophy colloquium series hosted by the philosophy department at my university. Now, unlike most of, if not every other paper delivered in the series, my topic had to do with the non-European philosophical tradition, namely Islamic philosophy. The title of the lecture was on death and dreaming in Islamic philosophy, and this, I suspect, was the reason so many people had attended, professors and students alike. After all, we all dream and we all experience death in one way or another, so the title would quite naturally speak to diverse kinds of audiences. Now, one of the main points made in the paper was that we cannot view Islamic philosophy as simply an extension of the Western philosophical tradition. We have to see it as on its own terms and in conversation, not with just late antiquity, but also as a representative of a philosophical tradition, a living one, that addresses its own theoretical problems through its own perspectives and worldviews. My task would have been made a lot easier if Peter Addison's Philosophy in the Islamic World had been published at that time. At any rate, I simply stated the point just mentioned as I moved along in the lecture. By the end of the talk, I was surprised to see how many people in the audience, including the colloquium organizers, were pleased and perhaps even relieved to hear of something so familiar and yet so different. Most of the questions and comments were well thought out and incisive, but then a professor of philosophy put up his hand and proceeded with voicing his objection to the points presented. You know, that kind of passive aggressive, let me push back a little bit. So he tried to push back and he said, you said that for the Islamic philosophical tradition, their philosophers view God as a best of plotters. But plotting implies deceit and deception, and these can hardly be qualities of a benevolent and omniscient God. If God plots, then he schemes, and if he schemes, then this implies some kind of badness, which means he cannot be God. What kind of Islamic philosophy is this? Now, flabbergasted, I offered the following response. Firstly, it is not the Muslim philosophers who call God the best of plotters. The phrase goes back to the Quran twice, 354 and 830, which says that God is khairul makirin, the best of plotters. It is true that plotting implies some kind of scheming, but what is wrong with that? In the Quran, God's scheming is juxtaposed with human scheming, which is of course fraught with folly. I then presented a proposition and an example, both of which most people can understand and perhaps with which they can even identify. The proposition was that plotting can be motivated by love and the fundamental care of people. The example I gave was this. In order to make it on time for the lecture, I had literally to come up with a plot with my wife of how we would divert our one-year-old son's attention to another part of the house in order for me to make my escape. Simply making an attempt to walk out of the house was not an option since it would sadden the child, which would mean I would have to console him, which would mean I would likely be late to the lecture. Or worse, I would have to drive faster than usual to work and then put myself and others in danger on the road. I continued, so sir, you can see how plotting need not always be evil and bad, even on the human scale. This applies a fortiori on the divine scale. My interlocutor was silenced. A whole other way of thinking about God had been presented to him through the example of human plotting, and one which I hope would have challenged the very categories with which he would henceforth approach issues in the so-called discipline of the philosophy of religion. Then I concluded, allow me to zero in on your question, sir. Saying that God plots or schemes may be troublesome for a certain kind of thinker whose focus is traditional Western philosophy of religion, which has always been dictated by Christian and largely Eurocentric problem sets and categories, analytic philosophy. If we look outside of that perspective, we will see that apart from one particular worldview, other philosophical worldviews like the Islamic have their own ways of conceiving of their indigenous problems. And if God's plotting means something in that worldview, which it certainly does, then let it stand on its own and let us hear what Muslims have to say about it. We can then evaluate the position's coherence, value, and the like. Had another book been published at that time, namely Timothy Knepper's The End of Philosophy of Religion, I would have certainly drawn my questioner's attention to it. In this work, Knepper argues that the so-called discipline of the philosophy of religion has to move far beyond the traditional confines and issues that have animated this tradition in the modern Western academy. It is a much more global phenomenon, he says, and this because other major philosophical and religious traditions have also been concerned with what we would call philosophy of religion. It is just that the problems posed by these other traditions' worldviews have often been quite different from, but no less important than, the fundamental philosophical and religious problems identified by Christianity as essential. Indeed, viewing philosophy of religion through a global perspective can, at minimum, help enliven and reshape the narrow and ill-defined, but still quite dominant field of the philosophy of religion, as we've been doing the past few days. So it's very much in that direction. One issue that can fall within the purview of philosophy of religion on the one hand and the domain of theology on the other is that of what is known as the silence of God. Now, this can refer to God's being silent today as juxtaposed to his having spoken at some point in the past. Framed in this context, this has to do with the manner in which God spoke specifically to Jews and Christians in the past, but does not appear to do so anymore, at least not through the medium of revelation. Related to the Judeo-Christian problem of God no longer communicating to human beings is the more universal fact of God's perceived silence in the face of human suffering. For many theologians today, this does not mean that God is somehow unaware of or oblivious to the plight of humans. Rather, in spite of his omniscience and benevolence, God seems to allow certain kinds of wrongs to happen to people. Making sense of why this is the case and what this can mean in the long run also pertains to reflections on what can perhaps be referred to as silence of God theology. One may argue that silence of God theology is marked by fundamental humility, since believers can accept the fact of human suffering and the very real possibility that God is not doing something about this human suffering right now, but that there is a profound wisdom behind this divine silence, which will be made known at some point in the future, if not in the afterlife. Some who delve into this question are certainly led to opposing conclusions. God is more like a clockmaker, as posited by deism, rather than being a real actor in and through human affairs. Or, since there is no God, speaking of the silence of God is tantamount to saying that if there were a God, there would not be human suffering, especially on such grandiose scales as we have seen over the past century. Taking Nepper's insights on the importance of conceiving of the philosophy of religion through a global lens, what kind of problem, if at all, is the so-called silence of God in the Islamic metaphysical universe? As William Chittick puts it, if the Islamic metaphysicians of the past were presented with this idea, their response would likely be, and I'm quoting Professor Chittick, try listening for once. Try listening for once. After all, one of God's fundamental attributes in Islamic thought is that of speech, kalam. God is thus the speaking, mutakallim, which is taken to mean that God speaks eternally without ceasing speech at any moment. The great thinkers of the Islamic tradition would have delved deeply, of course, into what this divine speech entails and how it relates to God's self-reflexivity and to the created order. I will not attempt to engage these points here since they will take me too far afield. What is essential to keep in mind is that in Islamic metaphysics, God's being a speaking agent entails a cosmic picture in which all things are not only addressees of divine speech, but are themselves acts and embodiments of this speech. That is to say that God's speech in Islamic metaphysics has a self-reflexive aspect, and it also has a generative or ontologically productive aspect. For the Muslim sages in particular, all things in the cosmic order form so many individual parts of God's speech. They each arise within the divine creative breath, nafas, which brought the cosmos into existence. Or framed differently, we can say that each thing in the cosmos constitutes a reverberation of the divine command, amr, which itself brought the cosmos into being. Thus, human beings are themselves living proof that God is always speaking, since they exist as so many words which collectively account for one aspect of God's speech. God is therefore never silent, cosmologically speaking, nor is he silent, anthropologically speaking. But what about the actual problem of God's seeming silence in the face of human suffering? In order to do justice to this problem, some comments are in order concerning the existence of evil. The attempt to reconcile divine goodness with the existence of evil in the world is, as we have already seen throughout this conference, known as the problem of theodicy, a term which ultimately goes back to Leibniz. Well before him, however, the basic issue fundamental to theodicy was dealt with in many different civilizations and in a variety of ways. In the Islamic tradition, one of the earliest attempts at presenting a robust defense of divine goodness in the face of evil is to be found in the writings of Ibn Sina, whom we've encountered last paper. And of course, his account of theodicy had a very long life in the Islamic intellectual tradition. The basic features of his defense of divine goodness take us to the question of the presence of evil in the world. By evil is meant anything that is bad and which displays an absence to some degree of what is good. The answer to the question, does evil exist, is given in the affirmative. It is clear that all kinds of evil exist in the cosmos, both on grandiose and minuscule scales. Ibn Sina distinguishes between accidental and essential evils in the metaphysics section of his book of healing, Kitab al-Shifa. Accidental evils arise as a natural consequence of the created order. That is to say that bad things occur in the world by virtue of the world being what it is. On an elemental level, this means things like fire, which contain much benefit for people, by virtue of its intrinsic properties, can and do exercise much harm. Fire can thus warm a home, but it can also burn a person. If fire could not warm a home, it could also not burn that person. But by force of nature, it will necessarily do both. Essential evils are rather different. They amount to things not being realized in a particular substrate, which by nature ought to have that thing in question realized in it. Ibn Sina gives us the well-known case of blindness. It is an instance of essential evil because it entails the lack or privation of sight in a receptacle, the ocular faculty, which itself exists in order for the end of sight to be realized within it. Evils are therefore an inherent feature of our universe. Asking why evil exists if God is all good is tantamount to asking why the world exists if God is all good. Given what the world and the order of nature are, there will naturally be all kinds of disparities, variations, and even evils amongst the things in them, which is to say nothing of human freedom, which itself is the cause of much evil in the world. To seek a world where such features are not present is to ask for another kind of world than the present one. And if we could do that, then the very question of theodicy, which likely only has meaning in our current cosmic configuration, would be meaningless. Having come away with a basic picture of how the Islamic metaphysical tradition thinks about the presence of evils in the world, I can now turn my attention to how the tradition deals with them, practically speaking. Since it has already been established that from an Islamic metaphysical perspective, God is never silent, and that evils are a real and necessary feature of the cosmic order, what can be said about human suffering and the divine response to it? In other words, when humans suffer, especially in the worst of possible ways, where is God's voice amidst all of it? Part of the problem, as I see it, with speaking of the so-called silence of God, is that it assumes that the presence and even persistence of human suffering require God to respond in a certain way and perhaps even at a certain time. This is quite a natural human tendency and is evinced by both the Bible, the book of Job, the Psalms, and the Quran, Surah Baqarah, for example. But in a person's weakest and darkest moments, does God really abandon her, or is something else at work? Does God not always respond even if we do not hear him? One can do no better here than to call to mind the famous 20th century poem known as Footprints or Footprints in the Sand. I have a few minutes left, so I'm going to actually read the poem to you. It goes like this. One night I dreamed I was walking along the beach with the Lord. Many scenes from my life flashed across the sky. In each scene, I noticed footprints in the sand. Sometimes there were two sets of footprints. Other times there was one set of footprints. This bothered me because I noticed that during the low periods of my life, when I was suffering from anguish, sorrow, or defeat, I could see only one set of footprints. So I said to the Lord, you promised me, Lord, that if I followed you, you would always walk with me. But I have noticed that during the most trying periods of my life, there have been only one set of footprints in the sand. Why, when I needed you most, have you not been there for me? The Lord replied, the times when you have seen only one set of footprints are when I was carrying you. Now, thus the most downtrodden and awful times, the poem teaches us, we drag ourselves along thinking that we are alone in our suffering and our plight, only to realize that it was God who was carrying us all the while. This also calls to mind a story in Jalaluddin Rumi's famous Masnavi, and Amr Latif had mentioned it yesterday, and so we'll have a chance to recount it here as well. He tells the tale of a man who calls out to God in earnest all night in prayer, but the man hears no divine response. And it is then, of course, that Satan comes upon the scene and tries to convince the dejected person that there is no God to hear him, and that he should thus give up hope in the divine altogether. At this point, the broken-hearted servant falls asleep and has a dream in which he comes to learn that God had in fact been answering his call all along. So the famous Rumi in his poem, it goes like this: the fear, this is God telling the servant, the fear and love you express are what tie you to my bounty. Under every, O Lord of yours, under every, O Lord, from you were many labaiks from me. Tarso ishq to kamand lutf mast, zira har ya Rabb to labaik hast. Labaik, or here I am, is the well-known phrase that Muslims utter during the rites of the pilgrimage to Makkah. For Rumi, it is not man who says, here I am, rather it is God who says it to man. And this is not only in some circumstances, but always and forever. In other words, God's presence and aid are always there, however imperceptible they may be to our limited human understanding and experience of the world. On a more subtle level, Rumi is also driving home the point that our very calling out to God is itself the divine response to our prayers. For the Muslim metaphysicians, being able to hear God's call, here I am, goes back to the fundamental importance of cultivating the right kind of hearing. How can this be done? The answer lies in human silence. By bringing the soul to rest and eliminating what the Muslim doctors of the heart call internal chatter, or hadithun nafs, our souls become more prone to attentively hearing God's voice within our own selves. In our world, filled as it is with all kinds of cacophonic sounds and alarming images, cultivating this kind of inwardness is difficult indeed. But the more engrossed we remain in these sounds and images, the less will we be able to hear God's voice and see his signs. Teaching ourselves to be silent not only takes us away from the internal noises within, but it also can drown out the noises without, one of which is our own voices. That is not to say that one should be silent in the world or in the face of oppression and the like. Rather, the silence in question is an attitude of the soul. It is something of a fundamental spiritual orientation in the world that allows a person's own voice to recede to the background. By becoming silent in this way, we therefore cease to be deaf to God's eternal audition. Hearing God's voice in the face of terrible suffering will certainly not help explain the suffering away or somehow relativize or trivialize it. By the same token, cultivating the ability to hear God's voice is not preconditioned on man's being able to figure out the why and the how of suffering. What is certain is that for those not spiritually tone deaf to God's speech, the very sound of the divine voice amidst all of the pain in the world can serve as a soothing balm for the soul, healing even the deepest of wounds. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rustom, for your presentation. So let me see if we have comments or questions. So the panelists, please use the raise hand button if you have a question or comment, and then we'll put you in order and you'll be able to use your microphone as well. I think everyone is trying to absorb this profound meditations. Usually, if people disagree, there are always lots of questions, comments. But when people agree, silence is a sign of.
The discussion ends on silence, so it's it's fitting that no one said.
Yeah, no, I think you really brought out some really interesting points, especially when the way people frame the question of evil in the Western tradition, especially Christian theologians, as you had mentioned, they seem to have a particular notion of divinity, and they seem to think of certain attributes like perfection, eternity, aseity, and those, and they're all kind of good qualities. Let's put it, good qualities. And then when they see something like evil, suffering, and then think about the question, how do you square? But as we know, as we have learned in the Islamic tradition, you already have this perspective that allows you to see God as the source of all of these different phenomena, including evil ones, because some of God's names actually express that, like the name of God, Ador, for example, the one who causes harm. So God is not simply Ar-Rahman, he's also someone in Islam, it's in the Quran, causes harm. He creates life, he also creates death. He's an avenger, Al-Muntaqim. So, but this is not Manichaeism, because if you have just simple Manichaeism or a simple version of Zoroastrianism, again, Zoroastrianism itself can be complicated. You simply think, it's, there are already two forces. One is the force. I don't want to invoke Star Wars too much, but like the force of evil and the force of good, or Nahiman, but it's not like that, because the ultimate reality of God, the divine essence, the infinite reality of God, surpasses all of these names and qualities, determinations, etc. But then God, by virtue of that ontological infinitude, you have all of these names and qualities, and etc. Let me see if there is any question or comment.
Melanie Coughlin, my colleague Carlson, she has a very pertinent question. It's about the distinction between accidental and essential evils. I'm going to take the easy way out just because of time. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to refer Melanie to one of my articles. Melanie, I'll send it to you, the article which deals with this distinction. If I get into that now, it'll require way too much time to unpack those distinctions in any great detail. My apologies, but we can certainly revisit this, perhaps during the Q&A later at the end of this panel, and I can also send the piece along to you. In fact, I'll just make it available to all of you, as I have been doing with the other.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. So they're all comments appreciating your thoughts on this. So yeah. Ali Elia, for example, saying, no, Mukhtar Ali, no, let me begin. Oh, mashallah, there are so many thank yous and all. Beautiful, many thanks, Nicholas. Mukhtar Ali, thank you. Elia, thank you for, this is so beautiful and moving. And then someone said, and then Sarah Aziz, thank you, lovely talk and poetry. Sanam, Hina Khalid, beautiful as always, wonderful talk. I could go on and on.
You guys
so just one comment, there is simply, just one comment, I think. There is simply nothing to clarify or ask. All E's are dotted and all T's crossed. Evil is a natural outcome of the world's contingency and God's otherness. If you'd like to comment.
Allow me just to say one more thing. Joel Richmond, our Dr. Joel Richmond, he's not presenting at this conference, but in our volumes proceedings, he also has an article coming that he'll publish, and in that article he also deals with this distinction in Avicenna. So that's a further source that I could point you all to. You have to wait about 1.5 years for that volume to come out. Yeah. But so anyway, that's just to complete to answer, give a more rounded answer to that question. I should say one thing. I thank all of you for your husnul dhan. In Arabic, when they translate it from Arabic and English, they normally translate husnul dhan as a good opinion. But as Professor Chittick always points out, things like this, it's not a khairul dhan, it's husnul dhan. It's a beautiful opinion. So you can only have a beautiful opinion if you have beauty in yourselves. So really, when you have a husnul dhan of some dervish or something, that's from the beauty from within yourselves. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much.